Turn it on is what I need to do. Thank you. Hey, thanks for investing some more time in thinking about church leadership and the ways in which you can continue living into this vision as a congregation. As Michelle and I were talking about, hey, can you come preach sometime, looking at calendar, putting things together, picking today, I said, we can still do some kind of a workshop, but I know it's like that Sunday before Thanksgiving. Does that matter? She said, oh, man, we have charge conference that afternoon, but it'd be good to have some conversation around some of those things, so let's do it. So my promise to you was going to be that we'd be done by noon so you could get to lunch, but maybe you feel like you already ate lunch. I don't know. I know I just ate dessert. I don't know if I ate lunch or not, but I was grateful there. I still will have us done at noon. I know that the rest of you have days to get on to. I really am thinking about three movements to this conversation today, and I think even in a little bit over an hour, we can do the three of them. You always have to call something, so we talked about a workshop on relational evangelism. I realize that could have all sorts of triggers for all sorts of folks, so just to offer any initial assurance to those of you who hear the word evangelism and are not sure you're in the right place, I'm not asking you to take tracts to your neighbor's front door and ask them if they would be in heaven or hell tomorrow if they would die, right? Like, this is not that conversation. But does anybody know, like, what the word evangelism really means? I think it's a good place to start for this conversation, right? So it's a translation into English from the Greek word evangelion. And if you are looking at like an old King James Bible or a Greek text of the scriptures, you'll actually see, and I'm terrible at Greek, but like Evangelion Matthäus, Evangelion Marcos, Matthew, Mark, Luke, John. Evangelion means good news. And it's also translated as gospel. And so the gospel, according to Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, is the Evangelion. It is the good news. And so the idea behind evangelism is that there is some kind of good news related to Jesus of Nazareth, his life, his ministry, his teaching, his death, his resurrection, and this church that was birthed when the Spirit came upon some of his earliest followers. And so we as the church have the privilege of carrying that good news and sharing that good news with our neighbors. The first movement that I want to spend maybe the least amount of time on today, though, is kind of a framework or a context to understand why sharing the good news can be so challenging in the 21st century. And it has to do, I think, a lot with shifts that have happened. I alluded to this in worship today. Go back and pick a point in history. I'm going to kind of think like the mid-1950s. Church existed very differently in the world than it does today. We all can kind of understand that intellectually, but to understand like the significant shifts that have happened is one other thing. Often when I talk about discipleship, which is following Jesus or being an apprentice of Jesus, I'll say I think we've created, kind of accidentally and slowly over time, this cultural hairball in the United States that takes discipleship, following Jesus intentionally, and being a church member, and being an upstanding citizen or community member, and being a patriotic American, and being a polite Midwesterner, and it just kind of lumps all five of those things together. And I think that starts like post-World War II and into the boom in churches and communities in the 1950s. And so as you start to peel some of those things back over the last decades, you might know business and civic leaders in Aurora today who epitomize being an upstanding citizen, and they don't have a church home. And a generation ago, that would have been unheard of. You know, in the early 80s, I have some friends that were launching a franchise of a hardware store. Part of their training that they received from corporate was, when you get to town, you need to join a church because that's important for making community relationships to grow your business, right? I highly doubt that that training exists in 2023. When you get to town, they might say join the Chamber of Commerce. They might say get involved in civic organizations. But the idea of whether you're in church or not does not have the cultural weight that it did at that time period. And so part of what has happened then, and I know very little about Aurora specifically, like a little bit of research, a little bit of talk with Pastor Michelle. I don't know anything about who's in the room with me today. So if it feels personal, that's just the Spirit kind of working on something. I'm not picking on you, I promise. But what has happened in many churches today is that the world has changed profoundly around us, and we know that to reach the next generations, we need to change things inside our walls, and we don't want to. Like, we like what we have the way we have it. We are comfortable in our routines and our language and our way of engaging. I saw a lot of things today that tell me y'all are already willing to make sacrifices to the way it's always been done for the sake of creating community, right? The acolytes, I'm guessing that in the 1980s they were wearing robes like the choir was wearing, right? And now you're able to say, like, we don't really care if they wear robes. Like, what's important is that the kids have a place of connection here and that they can serve Christ. And the little sash felt like a really lovely compromise. Like, it sets them apart for an intentional service and worship, but they can just come as they are. Right? Anyway, this is that first movement, a quick walk through what I talk about as institutional and missional paradigms for being the church. And I don't want to, like I said, belabor this too terribly much, but it's a framework that I think is helpful for understanding the other part of the conversation today. I'm guessing when I say the word institution or institutional, things come to mind, right? Churches, one, maybe school districts, maybe companies, maybe civics organizations, you know. Shout out some characteristics of an institution. What do you think of when you think of an institution? Systematic. Strength. That's right. Institutions have a strength to them. What's that strength and the systematic nature bring to it? Stability, right? Dependability, predictability, all of those things, like, put an institution into place. If you think about, like, something that's missional, and I don't necessarily, this word's tricky for us in the church, right? I don't necessarily mean like donating money to a missionary in Africa. I mean an organization that's functioning as called by God on a mission, right? So what's that look like or feel like? No. If an organization is institutional, they shared institutional conjures up strength, systematic, dependable. If you're a missional organization, well, here maybe I'll paint a picture based on what we just did in the last hour. Think about how we get food we eat. If you go to a restaurant, particularly if it's a chain, that's driven by an institutional model, right? Like, when we travel across the country, we really don't want to eat another meal at McDonald's, but we know the bathroom's going to be clean enough. We know what the menu's going to be. We know that we're going to get it quickly. We know what to expect, right? So when we engage an institution to feed us, we go with a sense of expectation around what's going to be provided for us. I think potluck when I think like a missional group, right? Kind of messy. You're not really sure what's in that casserole. You don't know where it came from. It's probably safe to eat. You'll take some because in case it was the person behind you in line that brought it, you don't want to hurt their feelings. Like, there's a relational, connected, messy thing that's going on here. And part of the invitation that I'm extending to churches all across the conference is to live into this shift, as hard as it is and is going to continue to be, to think less about being institutional in focus and more missional in focus. And again, these are not opposite sides of the same coin, so there's not a switch that you flip. I served a church once, and they were like, okay, but how do we do it? Like, they were looking for, like, the switch to flip, and then boom, now we're this. Think of this as a continuum, Every church exists somewhere on that continuum. But if you are primarily focused on an institutional model, the most important thing is preserving the institution. If you're focused in a more missional paradigm, the most important thing is the mission, pursuing God. If you're a United Methodist congregation that says your mission is to make disciples of Jesus Christ for the transformation of the world, the most important thing is to make disciples of Jesus Christ for the transformation of the world. And you're willing to start questioning some of the institutional assumptions like, does that only happen on Sunday morning? Does that only happen in the building? Does that only happen when the paid professionals are leading things? Does that only happen XYZ, right? And I loved Aaron's talk today celebrating the grant announcement about faith formation in home and resourcing. I mean, I think that's one of those keys of a missional thing. Like, what if families are resourcing their kids and the other kids in the neighborhood to think about how to pray and to read the scriptures and to practice spiritual practices as an extension of and a continuation of the 1 hour or the 2-3 hours that they spend here each week. So again, I really don't want to spend, I can do a full hour on this, and I don't want us to lose sight of the other things to do. But thinking briefly about the way that 3 different groups of people engage differently in these 2 types of organizations. Now let's think about church specifically, right? We already talked about restaurants, right? If you're a customer who goes to McDonald's, you have expectations that the food's going to be quick, relatively inexpensive, fresh as that is, right? In the world of the church, who would you say the customer is in an institutional paradigm? Anybody? Say it loud. I think you've got it. Say it loud. No. The congregation. Thank you. Specifically, I'm going to say members, right? Because if you're a member of an institution, let's say country club, if you pay your dues to the country club, you have expectations of what you're going to get in return. So you're a customer in relationship to that organization, right? And so long-standing, for decades, members of churches have kind of seen themselves as the customer. And so you evaluate how the pastor's doing, right? Is it good enough? Is it meeting our needs, right? The employee in this model is the pastor, and maybe other paid staff if you've got paid staff. But this idea that we as the customers are going to pay the pastor and the staff to make sure that our religious goods and services are prepared to our liking. The leadership then becomes who? Volunteer. I'm thinking about a specific volunteer group in a church. Church council. That's right. And I just call that elected officials or leaders because church council, ad board, whatever. Different churches call it different things. Now, where do these people come from before they are elected? The membership, right? So how many crazy conflicts of interest does that create when, again, this is not about Aurora. I don't know your congregation well enough to tell the stories about things here, but I have served a church where this version of a conversation happens. The staff parish chair comes to the pastor, imagine a new pastor, and says, hey, pastor, we really love your energy and your ideas, but, Mrs. Jones has been here a long time, and she's very generous to help pay the bills of the church, and she's uncomfortable with how much you're talking about change. Would you please talk about change less, right? So the elected officials putting the brakes on the pastor staff to make sure that the members are satisfied, because really they would never say it explicitly in a situation like this, but the functioning becomes the most important thing is preserving the institution. If Mrs. Smith stops donating whatever she donates every year, we don't know how we'll pay the utility bills, and so we have to keep her happy. Becomes the mission more than the mission. All right. In a missional context, then, who do you think the customer would be? The unchurched. Thank you. And I'm an optimist, so I like to say the not yet churched. And really, even I'd say the not yet disciples, if the mission is to make disciples. Because again, I don't know if this is true for you all, but I have been in churches where I'm not sure all of the members would be comfortable claiming the identity of a disciple, right? And that sounds kind of strange when you think about it. But like Dallas Willard, who I referenced earlier, his definition of a disciple is somebody who's intentionally following Jesus, a student of Jesus, apprenticing under Jesus, with the intention of learning to live my life how Jesus would live my life if Jesus were me. I love that definition. And I think sometimes there are church members who are good and faithful members. Please don't hear me being critical of this space. It's just part of what's happened in the cultural shift. There are good and faithful church members who have never been told that what they do here on Sunday morning or during the week has much to do with following Jesus or forming their life in the rhythms of following Jesus. The not yet, the unchurched, the neighbors, perhaps, are the customer. Who's the employee in that missional model? The congregation, the members. What? We'll come back to that in just a minute. And then who's the leadership? It's both and, right? It's a trick question. It becomes the pastor and those elected leaders in working relationship with each other. Where together they're identifying and clarifying the vision and mission, and then together they're holding each other accountable in pursuit of that mission and that vision. That's a United Methodist answer. There are some traditions that wouldn't include the elected leaders in that necessarily. They'd say the pastor is the leader, and then the board's going to evaluate how the pastor's doing in leading. But in our United Methodist system, good pastors know that in any given year, they can be called on to a different appointment. And so it's crucial that the pastor and the leaders of the church are working together in that leadership space. Pastor, thanks for tolerating my handwriting too. I know it's terrible. Okay, I said I'd come back up here real quick, and then we'll move on to the rest of the conversation. This is just to give some of the context. If you are the members of the church, and you've historically existed in kind of this institutional paradigm where you expect to come and have music and preaching and decoration and worship design all done to your liking, and suddenly the system starts getting curious about how do we do those things, worship, preaching, design, with an intentionality to reach our neighbors who are not yet followers of Jesus. And to do that, you're asked to make a shift from a customer to a leader, to an employee, excuse me. How's that feel? Uncomfortable. Thanks for your vulnerability around that, right? That's a very gentle word for it, too. Like, I think I'm not going to say some of the things standing here in this spot that I might think people feel there, right? But I think it is uncomfortable to the degree that people feel like there's been a bait and switch. Wait a minute, I always thought church was about this, and now you're telling me it's about that? I think related to that, people experience loss and grief. I miss the days when I could just come to church and hear an inspiring message for my week. I don't understand why I'm being asked to do X, Y, and Z for the sake of other people. But the call of Christ on our lives has always been, Matthew 28, go and make disciples of all nations, baptizing them, teaching, remembering, I'm with you always to the end of the age. And going back to the mid-1950s, culturally, we assumed that this was a Christian country and that our neighbors were Christian, and they either were good Christians or bad Christians. They were either Methodist or Presbyterians, but we thought about missionary work. Sorry, Kieran. We thought about missionary work as the stuff that happened overseas in unchristian places. But I'm not going to get any of the demographics right, but the studies are showing us that, like, the persons who would say they are none, that's not Roman Catholic sisters. That's on surveys. When asked what their religious preference is, they are willing to say, I don't have a religious preference. I don't call myself Christian. I don't call myself Buddhist or Hindu or Muslim or Jewish. I'm willing to say nothing. I am a none. That percentage of people is rising exponentially in the United States. And so in a way, unlike ever before, our neighbors are unchurched. Our neighbors might not be disciples of Jesus. And so now the paradigm is shifting on us in a way that is uncomfortable. because we've never really been trained to like talk about our faith or the difference that God makes in our life, or to invite other people to come and to see what God is doing in our lives individually and in community. All right? So just to foreground, like, it's an uncomfortable conversation because we're talking about, really at the end of the day today, like, I am going to give you all a tool as a church that you might consider using even as soon as the next few weeks leading up to Christmas Eve. Maybe you'll need to think about it and think about Easter as a time to do that. But going to encourage you to think about, how do I step out of my comfort zone in the places that I work and live and play to start talking about my faith and to start inviting other people to think about the difference that God might make in their life too. Because again, that's the good news, right? My sense is you're here at some level because you could articulate the goodness of God in your life and in the world. And it might be hard to articulate that. How many of you, out of curiosity, were raised in a church? Would you raise your hand for me and hold them up? Raised in a church, whether it's this church or another one. Okay. How many of you who did not raise your hand, if I can keep putting you on the spot, married into a church? Nobody adding that? One, kind of, sort of, right? So a few of you might have a story to tell about how you came to faith. I think about the Amazing Grace, right? I was lost and then I was found. I was blind and now I see, you know. But many of us, myself included, just grew up in the church. I was baptized at 6 months old, Sunday school, youth group, confirmation. You know, I tell my story, and sometimes I'll say I'm embarrassed even. When I said yes to a call to ministry in the United Methodist Church, I never really thought that had anything to do with the not yet. Like, I just didn't get it. Like, I thought that the bishop would send me to a church. They would be relatively satisfied that I was there. I'm a nice enough guy. I would be a tolerable preacher. We'd have potlucks. We'd have funerals. We'd have weddings. It would be lovely. Sometimes people would move to town. Maybe they'd want to come be a part of our church if they were already United Methodist. And really the goal in that was like, be better than the Presbyterians, you know, and then people will want to come through your doors. That's not the question that folks are asking anymore today. We've got a couple minutes. I'd be curious. React to this for me. Respond to this. How's it feeling? Good. Excited. Okay. Yeah. And when I do an hour on this, I ask you, like, think about a continuum and think about where your church is currently on that continuum. More institutional, more missional. I ask you to think about what direction you think the church is moving. And we talk a lot about how it feels. Like, how do you think it feels to be in one space versus the other space? And often it's excited and terrified, kind of in relationship with each other, right? Like, terrified. Do y'all remember Saturn cars? You remember Saturn cars? The like late 80s through like mid 90s, like they were increasingly popular. A brand that GMC launched, just kind of a new alternative. Do you remember? I never went, so it's all hearsay. But did anybody ever go to a Saturn car dealership? So my understanding is they had a strategy where they were very, very low pressure. And so it'd be like, yeah, we have some cars. Oh, you want one? Like, yeah, well, you could probably have one of these, you know? And so I've heard people say, like United Methodists have often done evangelism like Saturn car dealerships, right? Like we have a church. Oh, you might have an interest in the church? Like, well, I mean, okay. Like, you could come to ours. Like, you know. So, yeah, I think as United Methodists, we've historically done a bad job because we rode the wave. I mean, I don't need to go too deep into the history, but, like, the reason that you find a United Methodist church across Kansas and Nebraska about every 20 miles, at least historically, is because that's about how far you could ride your horse in a day. And so as the frontier is settled, the Methodist movement is moving, and they had a compelling mission. They were going to spread scriptural holiness through all the land. And so they had that sense of like, we are spreading scriptural holiness in all of these communities. And in Topeka, where Josh and I live right now, First United Methodist was founded before the city of Topeka was actually a city and before the state of Kansas was actually a state. But like when people first showed up on that little plot of land and thought maybe we're going to make a city here, they thought, well, if we're going to have a city here, we probably should have a church too. And so the church is older than the city or the state. I mean, so as a denomination, kind of moving through history, we rode the wave of kind of the American prosperity and growth, and just communities were formed and churches were built, and they were bigger and better and bigger and better. And Aurora is a unique community in that you all have a sense of not just the church, I think, but what I see about the broader community. Like, you have a sense of independence and strength that's probably... Are you the county seat for Hamilton County? Yeah? So, like, there's a sense that you're a pretty healthy community for a long time moving forward. The further west you go in Kansas and Nebraska, small towns, man, like, it's going to be a hard next few decades as ag continues to shift, as healthcare and education continues to shift. So anyway, all that to say, like, we now are at this point of rethinking. How do we be clear about who we are and then not be afraid to talk about that? So it's the not be afraid to talk about it that I want to spend a little bit of time on today. Again, if you kind of feel your shoulders tense up or the hair at the back of your neck stand up when you hear the word evangelism, I'd invite you to just kind of take a couple of deep breaths and work to release that and to think about, I am experiencing goodness in my life and I want to share it with others. You do this already, right? Like, you go to Lincoln and you find a new Mexican restaurant and it's really, really special. You come back to Aurora and you're like, next time you're in Lincoln, you have to go to this Mexican restaurant. And you tell the good news to your neighbors and your friends already. Like, have you seen this movie? Like, you really need to see this movie. And it should probably be in the theaters because the special effects are so good. Go see this movie in the theaters, right? You experience good things and you tell people about it. But somehow, when it comes to our church space, we just have this sense of discomfort. And a big part of it is, for decades, you were told not to talk about politics or religion, right? And I'm just going to kind of ask the question, this is another conversation for another day, how's that working for us as a country, right? Like, is that the strategy that is building a more perfect union at this point? Is that the strategy that's helping more people connect with Christ's love? It doesn't seem that that's the case. Anyway, so please relax a little around the word evangelism. I promise you we're not going to go out knocking on doors, asking folks if they knew whether they'd go to heaven or hell tomorrow if they died. But I do want to encourage you to think about, how do you live out your faith in some intentional ways? If I had a process, and it's not like a formal process for relational evangelism, we're going to talk about a few general things that as individuals we might want to be mindful of, and then we'll talk about a congregation-wide process that you might consider. If I had a formal like relational evangelism process, the only step that I'm sure of is number one, and number one is don't be a jerk. Right? It's like, if you're going to take notes, like, write that down, right? Like, go home. If you learn nothing else today, like, don't be a jerk, right? But the idea would be that in our circles of influence, that's a phrase I like to use, and you've got lots of circles of influence, right? Even if you live by yourself, there are some neighbors that live near you, and they have opinions about you, and they trust you or don't to varying degrees based on how you've engaged with them. Many of us, though, have circles of influence that extend to a spouse or a partner with whom we live, kids or grandkids in our family, community organizations to which we're connected, schools, workplaces. Think about those places that you live and work and play and spend the other 167 hours in your week. Those are your circles of influence. And if you are increasingly going to think about how do I look for opportunities to share the good news of God's love in those places, people aren't going to want to hear your good news if you're a jerk, right? So that's number one. And that looks like a lot of different things, right? But when you think about the fruits of the Spirit in our faith, like love, peace, patience, gentleness, kindness, understanding, that's a great place to start. Am I doing those things? Do my coworkers experience me as a person who is loving and gracious and kind and gentle and patient and peaceful and understanding? And then think about, how do you grow in that, right? And my bias, and again, a different workshop, would be that spiritual practices are transformative in a way that I don't think I really heard talking about growing up in a mainline church. But beyond a Sunday morning experience, intentional spiritual formation practices, I really believe, and I'm not going to put Josh on the spot, but his older siblings said as much to me, I'm not as angry as I used to be. I have a lot of moments in my mind where I remember, and Josh, when he's 4, guess what 4-year-olds aren't good at? They're not good at tying their shoes. They're not good at zipping up their coats. They're not good at getting their things together to get out the door on time. And I have these memories of standing there in the doorway, so frustrated that we're going to be leaving late for preschool, and I'm sighing, and I'm saying passive aggressive things about how if only you had done what I told you to do last night, you'd be ready to leave on time, blah blah blah. And I think with both of my kids, there were moments where I would be so crabby, then I'd set them to tears, and we'd be even later getting where we were going to go. And somewhere along the way, I began to picture God's relationship with us, and to think about all the boneheaded things that I do, and all the times that I don't have my shoes tied, and I don't have my coat zipped, and I'm not ready to go on time. And God is gracious and loving and patient. And so how do I live those things in relationship? How do we live those things in relationship? So think about one of those circles of influence: neighborhood, workplace, social group. If I gave you the homework between now and the end of the year to have a spiritual conversation with somebody in one of those settings, would you feel excited or terrified? You don't have to answer that. My hope is a mix of continue, but I would think for many it would err towards terrified. What in the world does he mean? What's a spiritual conversation? I don't want to be perceived as one of those people. I think that's an anxiety that we carry. But here's a scenario that I would just invite you to think about. And a lot of this stuff I'd point you toward, if you are really interested in digging deeper, is a little book called Get Their Name, written by Bob Farr, Kay Cotan, and Doug Anderson. Bob Farr is now the Bishop of Missouri. Kay and Doug continue to do church development coaching stuff. There's a lot in here, but this general conversation around relational evangelism comes out of their work there. Imagine a coworker who's just experienced something catastrophic, death of a child, and at work they are clearly broken. And you care about them, but don't know what would be helpful or how to engage. Can you imagine that scenario? I know that feels really prevalent for me. You see somebody who's experiencing a painful thing, you have some level of care about them, though not a deep relationship. Those things often happen, and then we don't know how to react or respond. And my invitation is to start thinking now about how to get yourself in the position to respond when those things happen. Not in a manipulative way. This is not a win souls for Christ, get another notch in your salvation, whatever. This is about sharing the good news in all those places we live and work and play. But if that coworker is somebody who you don't really know because they kind of annoy you, and you avoid them in the break room, and you stay in your car a little bit longer when you see them walking in because you don't want to have to talk to them when you walk in, chances are there's not a great relationship there. And so if step one is don't be a jerk, step two would be intentionally lean into forming relationships in those places that you work and live and play. No ulterior motive, just build relationships for the sake of relationships. Get to know the people that you spend time with throughout the course of your days and weeks. Get to know what's important to them, who their family is, what they think is hilarious, what they watch on TV, their favorite Mexican restaurant in Lincoln, whatever. Work on relationships intentionally so that when those moments happen, you've earned the right to be heard in their life. And again, not because you're trying to manipulate anything, but because you're looking for that entry point to go beyond and I think we often do this, right? They probably know I'm a Christian. And so if they wanted to talk about churchy things, then they'd come and they'd initiate that conversation with me. But I'm going to just mostly keep ignoring them around work because I'm kind of uncomfortable around them and I don't know how to engage. Right? I think that's where we often live. But my invitation is to look for those opportunities when that coworker, neighbor, friend, family member, whoever it is, experiences that hardship. You are a trusted relationship already in their life, and you're able to say something like this. Hey, I understand that you just experienced a loss, and I can't imagine what that might be like. And I know that I could never go through anything like that without the work that God is constantly doing in my life, and I'd love to talk with you about what that means to me if you're interested. Right? I couldn't imagine doing that 10 years ago, saying that to somebody. Right? Even as a pastor, as a professional Christian, I couldn't imagine saying that to somebody 10 years ago. But those moments become transformative. And if our mission is making disciples of Jesus Christ for the transformation of the world, that transformation is also about how we transform that coworker's world when we say, God makes a difference in my life, and I'd be happy to talk to you about that if you have any interest. Because what we find is that it's in those moments where somebody has lost a loved one, they've moved to a new town, there's transitioning in a job, where some kind of life event has happened, that they're most open to those kinds of spiritual conversations, and they're most open to engaging. And so again, you're not looking for those opportunities to be manipulative, you're looking for those opportunities to evangelize, to share the good news, right? All right, that's kind of the second of the big movements for the conversation today. Again, the first is just this general cultural shift that has happened and is happening, and the invitation in our churches to think about how we be more missional. And the second movement would be that kind of individual prompt to think about how you individually in all of your circles of influence could be laying the groundwork to share that good news. Right? The third, and we're doing great on time. This is awesome. The third then is the bigger conversation, and this is Michelle. We can talk later if you get excited about this, and there's help in unpacking this further because it's a church-wide process. I call it really, and this is all I think I stole from Doug Anderson in a workshop a decade or so ago. So again, credit to Doug. And the idea, revolutionary, and invite a friend Sunday. Right? Now, because you're uncomfortable already with the idea that I'm asking you to develop relationships with coworkers to invite them to church, but I really believe that you love and trust your pastor. And so when the pastor starts asking you to do something and building systems, and a framework and giving you resources and tools to do that thing, it's really, really powerful. And so the invite a friend to Sunday idea is, and a congregation can do this. I've done it in local churches as many as 3 times a year. But the idea is pick a big Sunday that you know is going to be a great experience here, right? That you know is a significant moment in the life of your congregation, that you know somebody who would come and to join you as a guest on that day would have a positive experience. And so I think things like Christmas Eve worship. Some churches during Advent have like one Sunday where they do a whole lot of special music, and they'd actually think that's better than their Christmas Eve because everybody in their church goes to visit grandkids on Christmas Eve instead of coming. So again, it's not Christmas Eve that's magical, but it's like that time of year, whether it's a big special music Sunday or Christmas Eve, can be a good time to do that. Easter can be a good time to do that, but I've also, in some congregations, found that Palm Sunday is better than Easter because Palm Sunday might feel like it's really where your kids are doing the palm parade and you're sharing a pancake breakfast together and there's some better community experiences. And Easter often has become a much more like family-focused holiday. You'll come to worship, but then you're going home because you're having your like Easter meal as a family. So one of those two Sundays can be a good time to do it. Back to school Sunday is a really good time to do this. If you're doing some kind of a back to school kickoff, especially if like kids programming and youth programming and new adult classes are going to be starting for the new school year, it's a great time to do that. It also, and you know this, Michelle, works to like have sermon series that flow related to that, right? So the back to school invite a friend Sunday, I'd encourage folks to like have that stand alone in a sermon series so that if you're a guest that day, it doesn't feel like you're playing catch up and you missed, whatever happened the last 3 or 4 weeks. But be ready on that next Sunday to start a really compelling sermon series, right? So you invite everybody to Invite a Friend Sunday, and on Invite a Friend Sunday, as part of the benediction, you say, it was so good to have everybody with us this week. You don't want to miss next week because we're going to start this sermon series, and there you're maybe trying to address what are the questions that the nuns ask, or how do we be a church that really loves our community, whatever. All right, so I want to kind of teach around that process of how this Invite a Friend Sunday can work. Pack a pew Sunday, yeah, that's great. I am horrible with the handwriting, so again, I'm going to ask you to forgive me, but I think it's helpful to see some of these things tracked out. And so for the sake of like thinking calendar right now, I'm going to just pretend that we're working toward Christmas Eve this year, that evening service, right? It's that weird, the fourth Sunday of Advent's the morning of the 24th, and Christmas Eve is that evening. God bless you, church leaders. I'm grateful not to be serving in a local congregation when the calendar does that to us, right? But assuming that we want to invite people to come to Christmas Eve worship, think about the 4 weeks leading up to that. And I'm going to count the fourth week in this hypothetical as that morning. So it's kind of confusing, but bear with me. Again, the fourth Sunday of Advent, we would imagine there are more kind of regular church people present. And on Christmas Eve, you would expect that evening that you're going to have more community guests choose to come, right? So pick your Sunday and back up 4 weeks. So again, the morning of the 24th, the morning of the 17th, the morning of the 10th, and the morning of the 3rd. 1, 2, 3, 4 Sundays before the focused invitation. On the first Sunday, can I get a volunteer to help me out? You don't have to talk or use the microphone or write anything, but if somebody would just real quick pass these out for me, it'd be awesome. Y'all are still doing, thank you, Aaron, just one to everybody. Yep. Y'all are still doing a paper bulletin, which is great because it makes a really natural opportunity for this to happen. So if you want to do this, on that first Sunday, there's a blank index card in every bulletin. And if you're the usher, and somebody says, what's with this index card? Just, it's okay. Pastor's going to talk about it during service, But somewhere in the worship service, pastor, I think, is most effective. It could be Aaron. It could be Karen. It could be the lay leader. If you guys are saying, like, we're living into this as a church, we want to create relationships with God and with neighbors, maybe it's more powerful to have your council chair or your lay leader introduce this. But somebody hold one of those up on Sunday morning during worship and say, Christmas Eve is a really important night in the life of our church and of our community as a whole. And we think it's a great opportunity to invite our neighbors to come and be with us in worship. And so we're going to have an Invite a Friend event on Christmas Eve. And this note card is there to help you get prepared for that. What I want you to do, I'm going to make you do this right now. That's why you have a note card. Pastor to congregation, I'm going to give you a couple of minutes to think about people in your circles of influence that you might want to invite to be with us for worship on Christmas Eve. You don't even have to know their name. but I'm going to ask you to write them on your card. At least one, but maybe 2, 3, however many you can think of. If you can't think of their name, but you know new family that moved into the yellow house, you can write new family in the yellow house. If you think about the kid that always bags your groceries at the store, write the kid at the grocery store, right? But think about people who, for whatever reason, right now, like the Spirit's putting on your heart, might benefit from an invitation to Christmas Eve. Take about 2 minutes and write down some of those names now. And when I've done this in worship, Michelle, I've taken my phone out, set a timer for 2 minutes, and gone start. Or if you have, somebody wants to run a countdown timer on the screen, you can do that. You all can decide, do we play music? Do we not? Is it totally silent? Is it not? That might play into how you want to engage folks who are with you. You might want to take a minute and talk to them. Get a piece of paper, have a scrap of paper, do this also. But now what I want you to do with this piece of note card this week is keep it somewhere where you're going to see it regularly. Prop it up in the bathroom by where you brush your teeth in the morning, or tuck it inside your Bible if you read your Bible every day, or if you know that you're going to lose this as soon as you leave here, take a picture with your phone and set that picture as your lock screen so you see that picture whenever you look at your phone. But I want you to look at these names intentionally throughout the course of the next week and just be lifting them up in prayer, really in 2 key ways. Just pray for their well-being, like something laid them on your hearts this morning and you wrote their name down. So pray for their well-being. Whatever they have going on, Thanksgiving to Christmas, it's a crazy season. Pray for their well-being and pray for a natural opening in a conversation where you might invite them to join us on Christmas Eve. Okay? That's it. That's December 3rd. Check. December 10th in worship. Have blank note cards in the bulletin again, because my assumption is not everybody's here every week, right? And if you send out weekly communications, newsletters, emails, whatever, you can mention in there that you're doing it. But again, on December 10, same thing. Blank note cards. Acknowledge that many of you were probably here last week. Do you still know where your note card is? Have you been praying for them? Good. If you lost your note card or if you weren't here last week, we're going to set the whole thing up again. Assume that there were people who are present who didn't hear it last week. Here's what we're doing. Here's why. You've got a blank note card. If you still have your note card from last week, we're going to have about 2 minutes of silence now. And I would invite you to use those 2 minutes to simply be praying as you have been through this week, praying for their well-being, praying for the opportunity to invite them to church. But if you lost your note card last week or you were not with us last week, take these 2 minutes to fill out the note card, and then we'll be talking about what the next step is. Okay? So it's very, very same. I mean, church communication is such a challenging beast in the world today where, the pre-COVID number was the average person was in worship 1.6 Sundays a month, right? So to just think about you have half of your congregation who says, Pastor, why is the same thing in the newsletter every week? I know it already. Why are we just repeating things? And then you have somebody else who says, Pastor, why did nobody tell me about this? And they're talking about the exact same event, right? So to figure out communication is such a challenge. So you're doing almost exactly the same thing on the 10th. Make sense? Clear enough? Now, every church is different in terms of what their budget is, what their staffing is, how they can do things. But I find that if you can, starting on the 17th, for the last 2 weeks, don't put a blank note card in the bulletin. Have some available if somebody wasn't there the first 2 weeks, But again, in worship, for a few minutes, you're going to talk about the 24th is important. It's a good opportunity to invite our neighbors. Here's how we're going to do that. It's an Invite a Friend Sunday. For the last couple of weeks, we've done this. If you don't have a note card, you can grab one after worship and do this. But in the bulletin on the 17th, some kind of an invitation, some kind of a simple, you can do these in the office. They can be as simple as black and white, but some kind of a legit invitation that says, like, join us for Christmas Eve worship. The address of the church, the worship time, any pertinent details. Are you going to have cookies beforehand or cookies afterward? Are kids welcome in worship, or is nursery care available, or both? I mean, think about anything that somebody would want to know if they were being invited to church that can be on a simple quarter sheet of paper, and put like 2 in every bulletin. And so then what you're saying is, keep praying for these people and take this intentional tool and look for the opportunity. It's kind of a fun, like, it's not a trick, but it's kind of a fun, like, for 2 weeks you ask them to pray for the opportunity to invite people, and then on the 3rd week you give them that opportunity. So, like, you are an answer to their prayers on that 3rd week, right? Like, now you walk away from worship, and here's what I've experienced, right? Every time I've done this, when worship is over, there are those invitation postcards on the floor. Like there are people who just very Midwestern politely say, no, I'm not going to do this. I'm not comfortable with this. There are also people who drop their note card on the floor because, whatever, they were in a rush, or, we drop things sometimes as human beings. So an encouragement I would give is, don't ascribe motivation to anybody that you see doing anything related to this, right? Like, if you find, the invitation postcards on the floor where your church council chair sits, don't tell yourself, like, I knew they were against this, I knew they weren't going to be supportive. Like, don't make up stories like that about one another. Because on the next week, you got more. Same two invitation postcards in the bulletin. Have more available. Have more in the space that they can pick up, on their way out. But again, it's the same thing. And Michelle, I could talk with you specifically about kind of the progression I use. On the 2nd week, it's like, do you still have your note card? Have you been praying for them? And on the 3rd week, have you invited them yet? No, but here's a tool, right? On the 4th week, have you invited them yet? Well, be thinking about why not. Not out of guilt or shame or whatever, but just like, you've now for like 3 or 4 weeks been praying for the opportunity to invite this person to worship, and now you're holding this tool to invite people to worship. And so just, be curious about what's my barrier. Christmas is a great time to do this because you've got all sorts of excuses to invite people to things, right? Like, if you pass out cookies to your neighbors, like, just take one of those invitation cards and say, like, I don't know if you have a church home or not, but we'd love to have you join us for Christmas Eve. And Michelle can take this, I'm sure. Y'all can say, our pastor's making us do this thing, and it's kind of weird, and I'm not super comfortable with it, but I'm supposed to invite some people to church, so, here you go. It's kind of like the in between, right? It's not quite the Saturn car salesman approach, but it's like my pastor made me do it. Here's a postcard. Read it if you want to, kind of thing. Yeah, totally, right? The one negative to this calendar is that you don't have a week between that Sunday morning and the Christmas Eve. So it's okay, but maybe you still want to practice that. And then, Easter's March 31. Maybe Easter's a time you want to do that again. Palm Sunday is March 24. Maybe that's the time you want to do it. I found in doing this over a period of several years with the congregation a couple of things. No surprise, like, they don't like it at first, right? Like, it's just uncomfortable. And it's like we don't like when the doctor says, some of these health markers aren't looking good. You probably should eat some more vegetables. You probably should, get 30 minutes of moderate exercise a few times a week. You probably should reduce your sweets, whatever, right? But we know, like, that would be for my best. I should do that. My doctor is telling me those things because my doctor loves me. And so this is not about we're growing the church, right? This is not, and I wouldn't encourage goals around like how many come, and I wouldn't be discouraged if there aren't a lot of guests that come. The first few times you do this, it's less about getting guests to come, and it's more about you as a congregation kind of learning that rhythm and strengthening your muscles to talk about faith. Now, this invite a friend thing, it doesn't have to be like in that first step I was talking about where you've been praying for and really like developing relationships in the workplace. You might be developing a relationship with somebody and still have a sense of like, this is not the right time to invite them, right? Like that's okay. Like maybe next year is. But the Invite a Friend Sunday is just be praying for and thinking about who is somebody in my circle of influence who could benefit from an invitation to worship. New neighbors who have moved in, I see Aaron, I'll get you in just a minute. New neighbors who have just moved in near you are like the low-hanging fruit because you don't know. You don't know. It's not like you've been in a relationship with them for 5 years and you know they used to go to the Baptist church, but then they got mad and you're not really sure if they're still a member or not. Like, new members are easy. A little bit of hospitality, some kind of a gift, and an invitation. Aaron, yeah. Yes. Yes. Yes, perfect. That's great. Thank you. That's great. And that's a great example too of like in other years you might think is the Christmas Eve 24th time when the Invite a Friend Sunday is, or is it the kids program day? You know, you might want to say like you should come to our church. It's one of the most fun Sundays of the year. The kids have all this energy. Like there's no rules. You know, you never know what's going to happen. Like you don't want to miss it. Like maybe that. Yeah, 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 yeah. That's awesome. That's awesome. We don't like to be told no, right? We take it personally. As polite Midwesterners who are upstanding citizens, you know, who are all that hairball, it's scary to think about inviting somebody because they might look at you like you're nuts. I mean, right? There's that real fear I think that people carry. Like, if I invite this person to come to my church, it could change the way they think about me. They might think I'm one of those people, right? And so that it's a risk. Like I'm asking you to think about taking risks because we're back to this like being missional and thinking about how are we missionaries in all the places we live and work and play. And real quick, I'm aware of the clock, so I won't delay. I promise. This is a book that was really like probably life-changing for me. It's a simple like read it in an afternoon or on an airplane. The author's name is Michael Frost. The book is called Surprise the World, and the subtitle is The 5 Habits of Highly Missional People, right? You think about the old Covey, like highly effective people, right? 5 Habits of Highly Missional People. Mike Frost, I've come to really appreciate his work. He is an Australian. He is a missiologist, so he teaches at the university and seminary level around the history and current practice of missions globally. But in this, he talks about an acronym, BELLS. I think I have time to throw this in here real quick. And his invitation is to think about forming your life around this as a weekly rhythm. B is bless. E is eat with. The first L is learn. I'll unpack these each in just a minute. The second L is listen. And the fifth letter, the S, is reflecting on your sentness, what it is that we are sent by Jesus, who says to go and make disciples. So he says, in any given week, we are invited to think about how we can intentionally bless at least 3 people, at least 1 who is a part of your faith community, and at least 1 who's not a part of your faith community, right? And this is like simple as a word of affirmation, like being intentional about seeing a coworker who's struggling and saying, I just want to acknowledge, I know that this season has been really, really hard on you, and you're doing a great job, and I'm really glad we're on the same team. I mean, that's it, right? Like a 10-second investment of your time to see somebody and speak a blessing to them. You can write a card, you can give a gift, whatever, but to be intentional about blessing inside and outside of your faith community. To be intentional about eating with people inside and outside of your faith community. To be intentional about learning about Jesus through the study of the scriptures. To be intentional about listening to the movement of the Spirit in your life. And to be intentional, again, about reflecting on your sentness and really how you're doing with those other four things. The great story related to sentness and listening to the Spirit that I so appreciate, I don't remember if it was in his book or if somebody shared it in a workshop, but he talks about a dad and young kids that go out for walks in their neighborhood after dinner. And they begin to realize over the course of a summer that there's a house whose yard is getting like horribly overgrown. And the dad confesses that his first reaction is like frustration and anger, right? Like that is about to be a violation of the homeowners association rules. You know, like their lawn, they need to do something about that. That's problematic. Like, I don't know what's going on. But somewhere the Spirit works in him and he gets curious and says, I don't think anybody has moved in or out. And every summer since we've lived here, they've kept up with their lawn really well. I wonder what's going on. And he knocks on the door, and he learns from the woman who answers, my husband's just terribly, terribly ill. And he's been in the hospital, and I'm not keeping up on things at home. And so he organizes guys in the neighborhood, and they mow the lawn for the rest of the summer, right? Because he was present in his neighborhood and listening to the movement of the Spirit in his life, and willing to kind of step out in response to that. So would encourage you to do that. Finally, I'm back to the Invite a Friend Sunday. Again, you know this, but I think it's just important to say it. Make that day a big day intentionally. Like you're picking it already because it's a big day, but the more you can make your hospitality a big thing on that day is great. So think about whatever you do normally for greeters, like +1, right? Like whatever you do normally for the sign-in, it was great today. Like somebody brought Josh and me the attendance pad and handed it to us. That's important, right? Because you asked me in worship to sign the attendance pad, and I asked Josh, I'm like, do you see the attendance pad? We didn't see the attendance pad. Somebody brought it to us and handed it to us. That's what I'm supposed to sign. Like that's great. Do that kind of thing. But think about, is there a gift of some kind that you're going to give to guests on that day? Do you want them to go somewhere specific to the Welcome Center? You know, give directions around that. And then think about how you're springboarding off of that day into what's next. Even like if it's Christmas Eve, you're probably not starting a new sermon series on December 31. Like I know I never was when that calendar fell. But somewhere in early January, you're kind of kicking off that next semester. There's a new sermon series that's coming. You're relaunching Wednesday programming, whatever that is. So in your Christmas Eve bulletin, make sure you've got the invitations to what's next. Again, this is stuff we know, but I just find so many churches, especially post-COVID, we've let a lot of these practices slide. So just would encourage you to continue that. Okay, 11:59. I wanted to give more time for questions. I apologize for that, but I'd take them if you've got them. Any questions about the process, the paradigm, the general conversation? You're like, no, we all want to be done at noon. And again, if nobody comes, that's not the point. The point is us as the church getting comfortable extending the invitations and growing kind of in those muscles of missional living. I was really struck as we closed worship this morning. So I'll just kind of offer this as a closing to our time. I'm not singing it, I promise. But I'm back in 2237, that closing song, and we only sing that first verse. But as a fire is meant for burning, with a bright and warming flame, and we're in that season, right? Like, it's cold, it's rainy. You can picture that, right? If you imagine, like I'm sitting next to the warmth of a fire, I'm appreciating the glow of the flame. The very identity of who and what that fire is to provide that light and to provide that warmth. So the church is meant for mission, giving glory to God's name. Not to preach our creeds or customs, but to build a bridge of care. We join hands across the nations finding neighbors everywhere. So go from this time, continue the conversations in whatever ways you need to as church, to think about how this process or something like it might be helpful, and continue growing in God's great love for you so that you can share that great love with the world around you. Thanks again for the invitation today, Michelle. Yeah.